Alright, folks, welcome to the final mini lecture of the week. A few weeks ago, I ran across a social media post by Soledad O'Brien, an investigative journalist and commentator. O'Brien made the point that studying the lives of African American civil rights leaders was important because these people fought for change without any expectation that things would get better. They agitated against a system that marginalized them based off of skin color, and one that could imprison or force them into labor for minor offenses. They fought against the white supremacist terrorist practice of lynching, the public spectacle surrounding the mutilation and execution of black men. They fought for admissions to schools, whether elementary schools or to the premier institutions of American higher education. They fought for literacy programs and voting rights. They fought under the weight of the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson, which enabled the system of apartheid in the United States. As we saw in Redemption, John F. Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, which chronicled the biographies of politicians that Kennedy thought were courageous, including a few Southern white supremacists. Consider this lecture as a rebuttal in parts. These courageous black individuals fought against the odds and sacrificed greatly in the name of equal rights. Lucy Parsons was considered to be among the most dangerous women in the United States. In Chicago, the police said that Parsons could form a mob with a word and could turn out the unions and workers to protest in an instant. She was, quote, more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. Lucy Parsons was born in Texas in 1853 and was likely born into slavery to parents who may have been Native American, Black, or Mexican American. She and Albert Parsons married in 1871 and moved to Chicago to avoid repression due to their interracial marriage and repressive anti-miscegenation laws. After the execution of her husband by the state during the Haymarket Affair, Parsons began writing for a French anarchist journal and spoke alongside of other European anarchists in a tour in the 1880s and 1890s. Parsons was also a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and she edited its newspaper, The Liberator. She pushed the American Federation of Labor, the Socialist Party of Chicago, and Jane Addams's Progressive Hull House organization to demonstrate en masse against hunger and homelessness. Parsons consistently focused on class in her level of analysis and argued that women's oppression was intricately linked to their class. A quote of hers I found states, "Concentrated power can always be wielded in the interest of the few and at the expense of the many. Government, in its last analysis, is this power reduced to a science. Governments never lead, they follow progress. When the prison, stake, or scaffold can no longer silence the voice of the protesting minority, progress moves on a step, but not until then." Frederick Douglass was similarly born a slave, but well before Parsons. Douglass was also likely multiracial, with African American, Native American, and European heritage. He was born in 1818 and managed to escape slavery by fleeing to the North around age 20. It took a few attempts. Once he took his freedom from the slavers, Douglass became active as an abolitionist speaker and writer, and organized in the anti-slavery movement. He became a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, a famous black denomination out of New York City, and he associated with Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, two black women with whom it was unwise to tangle. He began publishing both an autobiography and a newspaper called the North Star. He was also the only African American to attend the feminist Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and at the convention agitated for voting rights for women. And he agitated for equal rights for women for the rest of his life, a sentiment often unreciprocated by many white feminists. After the Civil War, Douglass continued to agitate for equality, especially as the United States moved towards apartheid under Jim Crow laws, amidst organized violence against black equality. And he was active in pushing for black equality in his death until 1895. Regarding justice and equality, Douglass offered this, quote, "The American people have this to learn, that where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to rob, oppress, or degrade them, neither person nor property is safe." Ida B. Wells was also born into slavery, but in the middle of the Civil War. Freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, Wells moved with her family to Tennessee, and then had to support her family from the age of 16 when her parents died of yellow fever. Wells worked as a teacher for a while, and then she became a journalist, reporting on lynchings in the South and their use as a tool of white supremacist terrorism and a means to control and punish black people for being black and economically competing with whites. A close friend of Wells had been a victim of lynching for opening a grocery store in Memphis. A white mob invaded his store, and he was arrested by the sheriff and jailed. The white mob returned, attacked the jail, and killed him and two other black men. Ida B. Wells began documenting and reporting on lynchings in the South. One of the standard justifications offered for lynchings were that the black victim had made sexual approaches on a white woman. Wells disproved this. Instead, Wells proved that a lynching was a means of control through violence and terror. Following these reports, a mob burned down the offices of the newspaper for which she wrote. She also published the pamphlet Southern Horrors, The Lynch Law in All of Its Phases, and another book exploring the history of slavery and Jim Crow apartheid called The Red Record. Alongside of Frederick Douglass, Wells organized a black boycott of the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. She organized a black women's organization in Chicago and others. She agitated for women's suffrage and urban reform, and also aided immigrant aid organizations. She was one of the founders of the NAACP, but was later excluded from a list of its founders, quite possibly for being too radical. I think that her life and activism can be summed up from her own quote. "One had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap." The final black intellectual and activist I want to discuss is W.E.B. Du Bois. Unlike Parsons, Douglass, and Wells, Du Bois was not born into slavery. He was born after the end of the Civil War in Massachusetts and was raised in a relatively tolerant town. He attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, a historically black college, and then Harvard University, earning bachelor's degrees from both institutions. He received a fellowship and studied in Berlin, Germany for several years, under some of Europe's leading social scientists. He then returned to the U.S. and earned the first PhD awarded to an African American from Harvard University. He taught at Wilberforce University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Atlanta University. And he began forming his conception of the talented 10th, his proposal to uplift Black Americans in the United States to full equality. In his conception, the top 10% of the African American population needed professional advancement, education, and exposure, and that their increased prominence and presence would help expand Black rights nationwide. In 1910, Du Bois and many other Black activists came together to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP as it's called. He began a job editing the NAACP's newspaper, The Crisis. The NAACP today remains one of the United States' preeminent civil rights organizations. Du Bois agitated and also fought against the eugenics movement, and also fought for Black rights during World War I. He supported and promoted the Harlem Renaissance, a major movement of Black art, music, and creativity, and was a member of the Socialist Party of America. He was a prolific author, writing the famous book, The Souls of Black Folks, and challenging the prevailing Dunning narrative of Reconstruction in his seminal Black Reconstruction in America. He was the official delegate of the NAACP at the founding of the United Nations in 1945, and became a prominent Pan-Africanist intellectual and anti-colonialist. He was targeted in the 1950s in the McCarthy era for his socialist ties, which a later historian called, quote, ruthless repression and political assassination. In the early 60s, Du Bois traveled to Africa, and while there, the U.S. refused to renew his passport, effectively exiling him in 1963. Ghana gave him citizenship, and he died in Accra at the age 95, a year before the U.S. passed the Civil Rights Act. If history and politics ever seem daunting, look to these people for inspiration. They fought long and hard for what they believed in, for equality. They faced violence and threats to their lives, and they refused to give in to racial injustice. They stood on principle, and they stood up to power. I think that's it for this week's mini lectures, and I'll see you in the forums.